can I turn this foam skull and these resin teeth into a Turnip28 regiment in 3 days. Spoiler, if you're seeing this video, I probably did. So I'm very lucky to have an awesome local gaming scene filled with people wanting to play a variety of games. Shout out to the Rust Punks Discord. Now the downside to playing a bunch of games is having forces for all of them. This meant that when Turnip28 was brought up, I was determined to knock out a cool, playable force in the 3 days I had available. I figured my regiment organization would look something like this. A Toff, a couple of toadies, units of fodder and brutes, and a couple units of cavalry. Cavalry seemed like a good place to start, and I thought this box of Grognard's cavalry from Wargames Atlantic would work perfectly. I knew I wanted at least one unit of the cavalry to be just a little creepy, maybe with a skull head. So I grabbed a sprue from the skeleton cavalry kit from Wargames Atlantic, hacked off the horse skull, similarly cutting the head off the horse, and it was a pretty simple fit. A small change, but I was happy with the creepy factor. Since bashing together my Necromunda gang, I've been on a real head-swapping bender, and I knew I wouldn't be using any of the regular heads or any of the regular root vegetable-inspired heads. Nope, welcome to the tooth root. These cast resin teeth would serve as the heads for this Turnip28 regiment. I'd noticed that adding grass tufts to minis is kind of a cornerstone to a lot of Turnip28. I'm not entirely sure if it represents actual grass or more of the tiny hair-like roots that grow on root vegetables, but I like the vibe. So I got to some tufting. With cavalry complete, I started on some fodder. The game is set 1,000 years after Napoleon's defeat. However, Endless War has left the world stuck in that period, so Napoleonic minis felt like the place to start. My FLGS sells individual sprues from many companies, including these Prussian Reserves from Wargames Atlantic. A unit of fodder's 12 minis, so 2 sprues here was perfect. Quick addition of some teeth and tufts, and these dudes were done. After putting together a couple of toadies, basically toffs, but even more incompetent, I moved on to the Toff. Reading through the rules, the Procession of Woe seemed to be the most fitting cult for my cult of the Tooth Root. Now the Toff of this cult isn't a Toff per se, it's a root shrine, which for me meant using this foam skull. Now I figured a shrine should have some sort of door, so I cut away at the mouth, the ideal door location in a skull. Since I was working under these admittedly self-imposed time constraints, I wanted to keep things quite simple. So I just cut up some popsicle and coffee stir sticks, gluing them together in a rough door shape. White glue is a glue of choice here, as super glue tends to melt styrofoam. Then I cut a couple of wood discs for wheels. This root shrine does need to be mobile after all, and snagged a couple shields from the skeleton cavalry kit to use as hubs. Slop on some muddy ground texture, add a plethora of tufts, and we're ready to paint. With speed in mind, I used my own version of the classic base coat, highlight, wash, with a combination of airbrush, dry brush, and speed paints. The world of Turnip28 is very grungy and grim, which is cool, but I wanted to add some color. So I started by hosing everything down with a dark purple, making sure to cover all surfaces. This would serve as the darkest shadow color, but I covered everything to ensure that the paints that came after would cover better than just over black. Next, I grabbed some purple and began using it to add a fairly heavy zenithal highlight. slowly building the opacity so as to not blow out any of the shadows. The final airbrush step was to spray pink from the primary lighting angle, mostly the front and from above, to create some nice contrast from light to shadow. With the airbrush work done, I had some nice, colorful gradients, but I wanted to kick things up a notch. So I busted out the dry brush, adding some definition and detail with pale yellow. And this gave a nice result, if just a bit bright. To unify everything and dull it down slightly, it was time for a wash, which is where the speed paint comes in. Speed paints provide some interesting creative opportunities. By further thinning it with speed paint medium, we can use its recess finding properties to create a more effective wash. In this case, I grabbed dark wood and thinned it down 1 part dark wood to about 7 parts speed paint medium. Then I tried to drown each mini, slopping this concoction all over it. After giving it plenty of time to dry, I needed to add some color to the tufts. And for contrast, I decided on yellow-green. With a beat down, flat synthetic brush, I kind of overbrushed this onto the tufts, effectively using a dry brush kind of technique with more paint on the brush. Honestly, I was kind of surprised with how well the tufts took paint. Definitely something to consider with future projects. And that was it for paint on the root shrine. Skull shrine? But I wanted to add a little visual interest, a focal point, to the rest of the regiment. This meant quickly painting the horse skulls and all the tooth heads. I mixed some purple into neutral gray and started painting on some sketchy layers. Then mixed in some pale yellow to build the volumes. This was all done pretty quickly, only spending a couple of minutes per mini, just smushing some paint around to create some contrast and a little focal point. This world of Turnip28 is war-torn, decayed, and battered. So I wanted to keep the bases quite simple. Just laying down some golden brown and slopping on some Agrax Earthshade when it was dry. And with that, I had a regiment. The Cult of the Tooth Root. Completed in under 3 days. Sure, they're not incredible paint jobs, but I enjoyed doing it, and they look pretty great lined up on the table. Not everything needs to be a masterpiece, or even good. Sometimes, maybe even all the time, it's enough to smush some color onto our war dollies and get them onto the table with our friends. Because ultimately, playing games with our friends is what it's all about.